Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the session number 52 on interacting with integrated assessment models for target seeking under uncertainty. My name is Ssp. I'm co-chairing this session together with Merle Remy from Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam, Sarah Cornell from Stockholm Resilience Center, and Jan Kwakkel from Delft University of Technology. So if you look at the title or the presentations in this seminar, you might be a bit confused, and I totally understand that. So let me tell you a bit about how the idea came and what our aim, what our purpose in this session is. So we all have different backgrounds working with models, integrated assessment models with uncertainty and with stakeholder engagement. As you might remember, one of the recommendations resulting from the conclusions of the previous Scenarios Forum was to expand the uncertainty space, diversity of perspectives, and stakeholder participation in scenario development. I think there is a very nice paper by Brian O'Neill published in 2020, and this was summarized on Monday in the plenary session. So the idea of this session is to discuss how simple integrated assessment models can help to expand the uncertainty space in climate scenarios, how they can expand diversity of perspectives, and how we can enhance stakeholder participation in scenario development and scenario use. For that, we will have presentations touching upon each of these subjects. So we will have presentations talking about addressing uncertainty in models, taking uncertainty or different uncertainties into account. We will have a presentation about interfaces, online user interfaces to facilitate stakeholder participation in modeling and scenario development. And we will also have a specific participation about stakeholder engagement. So we have 4 presenters because one of the presenters couldn't make it, unfortunately. First, we will start with Damla Okoluk from Delft University of Technology to talk about exploring the distributive justice principles in IAMs. Damla, would you like to? And I think your slides are here.
Thank you. Thank you for the nice introduction. Hello, my name is Damla Okoluk. I'm a PhD student, first-year PhD student in Delft University of Technology. Today, I'll present our work exploring the distributive justice principles in integrated assessment models, iterative analysis on interregional justice. So here, you can see my presentation outline. First, I will explain the motivation behind this study and how we approach this problem, what was our methodology, and hopefully I will conclude with a couple of graphics that I found really important for a further discussion. So let's start. Climate change does not affect regions, generations, the basically actors equally in real life. However, most of the policy models do not show disparities among actors. And the current situation is most of the integrated assessment models use utilitarian approach, which basically you try to maximize aggregated utility, aggregated happiness of your actors in your model. So this could maintain or even reinforce existent inequality. The main question is, how can we get away from this inequality, or how much of this inequality is inevitable? How much of it comes within by nature? So the first step for answering this question resulted in one of my favorite quotes, which is premature aggregation is the root of evil. That basically means integrated assessment models use different level of aggregations in temporal, sectoral, or spatial scales. And what we did with this study is disaggregate. Looking for a different justice principles, we need to disaggregate among temporal, sectoral, or spatial scales, which we, as a case study, which we choose regional disaggregation, that I will explain later. So this study uses different frameworks to frame a complex real-world problem. We looked for the literature, and we ended up in we looked at literature in distributive justice principles in integrated assessment models for the last 15 years. We used a descriptive approach and ended up 18 different justice principles, which mathematically formulated, applied in the model, or conceptually mentioned in the paper. So if we go back to our inequality question, we take one variable, which is mitigation, and we paraphrase the question again. How can mitigation policies be more equitable and robust? So for the equitability, we managed to group these 18 different justice principles into 5 main clusters. And for the robustness, we used 5 different Ssp scenarios. And I'm sure that you are quite familiar with the SSPs. Yeah. To see trade-off between these principles, these frameworks, we applied to a really basic but mostly used model, regional integrated model of climate and the economy, RICE model. It's a simple model with plenty of criticism, I know, but still in use. So starting with this simple model, it can brought up the discussion space on justice in climate change. So RICE model basically integrates 4 submodels and tries to maximize aggregated utility, which is one single metric. So for the Ssp scenarios, again, we use these 5 different Ssp scenarios. Basically, each of them includes different socioeconomic challenges for adaptation and mitigation at the same time. Also, in here, in the left, you can see the I implemented in global population and global GDP, which we included as an input in the system for now. So this is not the updated version. And in the first day, in the first planetary, I remember that they basically said we need to update populations and GDP as soon as possible. So, okay, that was the model. So how we frame the different justice principles is, I will explain now. The definition of frameworks maps differently into objective space differently. So that's why we use different number of objective functions for each different justice principles. The main justice principles, the first one is utilitarianism, is basically you try to aggregate total happiness of the society, but you can define happiness in terms of different variables and different metrics. For utilitarianism, we used 8 different objectives, and to give you a quick idea what this means, I will just explain the definitions of each different principle, and I will show in a small frame what we used actually, but I will happy to discuss each of these formulations later in the discussion session or the questions, whatever. And for the egalitarianism, we used 6 different objectives. In egalitarianism, you basically try to equalize the utility between your actors. If you choose the regions, you can choose generations or sectors as your actors. Or water, actually, I heard it today, so it's a really interesting thing. For prioritarianism, we used, again, 6 different objective functions, and in here you give the most of the weight to the worst of region, and you try to maximize that worst of region, but also you give other weights to the other regions. Since we use regional disaggregation, my actors are regions. For the sufficientarianism, you set up a threshold, and according to that threshold, you try to move above that threshold or below that threshold, according to your problem definition, maximize or minimization, whatever you took in the objective. So Rawlsianism basically means that you try to maximize the minimum one, so you give all the weights to the worst of region, worst of member of the society. For that principle, we used 5 different objective functions. As a method, we use single scenario-based multi-objective robust decision making, and we didn't do a long-term analysis yet. We just did the short-term analysis according to Ssp scenarios. So Yeah, if you look at these graphs, actually, after the stress testing all of these policies in terms of in different scenarios, we ended up these graphics, but I'm not going to talk detail about these graphics. I choose a couple of extreme points, extreme policies from these graphics, and I put in a different slides that I will explain a little bit detail in here. So we use regional disaggregation to apply each of these principles, and these are our results. And here we are looking at subset objectives, considering a time period between 2005 and 2100. So we focus on global emissions and atmospheric temperature. Yeah, I'm not sure, can you see it, but the dark green one, this one in this graphic, and this one in this graphic, shows the utilitarian approach, which is currently used status quo approach. And it shows like high temperature and emissions for both graphics. For example, the egalitarianism shows like poor performance, and this can be explained. We use pure egalitarianism, which is problematic. It entails down into different regions. But you need to disaggregate more, basically, to perform better in egalitarianism. So, yeah, but for the prioritarianism, actually, this could be a promising approach, but we are again not sure, and it's open to improvement because it's some level hits the model boundaries, but it shows like promising approach among the regions. And yeah, in here I again like the left-hand side. I know that it's from different model. They in here they use MAGIC, and the right graphic that I showed from RISE, but main thing is if you don't apply any policy in Ssp scenarios, you're gonna end up in hell, basically. But yeah, but the right-hand side, if you use just different principles, you can end up in different results. And if you just change your perspective according to that fairness definitions in the literature, maybe you can open a couple of debates. Actually, since the last 2 days, I heard a lot of things about justice, fairness, how can we include them? What about feedback loops for the justice and stuff? So every time I heard these things, I know that there is no certain way right now to include those, but it's a starting point, and I think it's really important. So as a conclusion, we changed RISE structure, and actually it's not the RISE structure anymore. It's a different model, but again, it's a simulation optimization approach. As a simulation model, we used RISE, and optimization part, we used multi-objective evolutionary algorithms, which is Borg, but you can use also NSGA2 and the others. Yeah, actually we also did a benchmark study, but Borg works better, so we choose that one in here. We show that it has large consequences on mitigation and consequently the temperature. Utilitarian approach has more overshooting years than the other approaches except egalitarianism, and prioritarianism is a promising approach to keep up with Paris Agreement goals, which is 2 Celsius degree, and it changed to 1.5. So the take-home messages from this presentation is aggregation in different scales exaggerates the existent inequalities among regions. Actually, we showed the regions part, but also generations and sectors. Yeah, in here, you need to implement different fairness perspectives, and to implementing these fairness perspectives, you need more metrics and more variables. So that means actually you need more disaggregation. That's how it is connected as a whole, actually. And the second part, the second take-home message is different frameworks which use different justice principles could be the solution to avoid persistent inequality. Persistent inequality is not my term, but I really like to use that term. It's one of the papers from, like, latest paper from the Nature Climate Change. So also in here, I never met the guy, but in here they also presenting a poster presentation later on about the persistent inequality stuff. So if you're interested in, you can also ask him about that too. So for the future work, we want to include feedbacks in the system, since RISE, it has not feedback loop in it, within. So we're gonna try to apply like feedback from temperatures, emissions, but most importantly from the different justice principles with different metrics. So thank you for listening. Yeah. I can answer the questions.
Thank you very much, Damla. I think it will be very interesting once you also include the feedback loops and if you, thank you for reminding. So I was just saying, thank you very much, Damla. I think with the follow-up work, it will be even more interesting if impacts are included and if when the optimization functions representing different justice principles are tested on top of it. So I would like to have a few short clarification questions. If you have extended questions or extended comments, let's have it at the end after all the discussions, please. So short questions, I saw Edmundo and one hand there. Maybe we start here. Ah, yeah, thank you.
Congratulations, very interesting presentation. I wonder, there's two dynamic stressors that seems to be very important for the the stability of the justice principle, no? And one of those are changing incomes across regions. I mean, that's definitely, yeah. And the other one is cumulative emissions. I don't know if you're considering how the combination of those dynamic trends could affect the stability of different justice principles.
The other one is?
It's cumulative emissions, historic emissions for each one of the nations.
Yeah, actually the input, I am using I'm using they in terms of input data, and they really affects the results, of course, but this is the main thing about the scenarios and what if approach. Actually, we try to widen up as much as we can in the scenario space. So for example, we used 5 different Ssp scenarios, but for the next time, since we're going to include feedbacks and we're going to use Ssp scenarios to include like radial forces and stuff. So it depends on those things, like really dependent. But you can also, I don't know, update them. And if you can like find a proper data that you can divide also even more regions or even more sectors, it can be ended up in a different results. But again, I think the main part is they're affected, but we can see that even with these kind of data that are not like really detailed, we can see like stark differences between principles. So if we, in the future, if we can include more detailed data, I am sure that there will be like more differences according to them. But yeah, so thank you for the question and comments.
Yeah. My name is Laurens from Rocky Mountain Institute. It's more of a comment maybe, but I really like this approach because it's very, very elegant. So one of the, I think the most common critiques of IAMs that myself also converse about quite often is on the optimization approach of economic behavior, and basically that there's no difference between different actors. Yeah. And by changing or challenging that assumption, I think it's a very elegant approach to show different kinds of worlds with different kinds of beliefs that actually goes beyond a lot of the analysis of SSP, because it challenges like some of the core behavior within the different models in a fundamentally different way. So I think it's a really elegant approach. So that's just one kind of comment that I wanted to share.
Yeah, thank you for the comment, and I can add a little bit short thing about this. Also, I also like work, of course. But thank you. But the main thing is, for example, you said like it could be like widen. It could also go beyond the Ssp scenarios or go beyond the rice model and stuff. So yes, I totally agree, and the future research is going to be related to that for sure. Like just for now, after literature review and like grouping them include like different perspectives and stuff, we just wanted to show, even in this kind of setting, it shows a difference. So what happens next? It's just main points that you already talked. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Damla. I remember seeing more hands, but let's keep further questions to the end. So I would like to invite second presenter now, Jia Lee from World Bank.
Thanks. All right. I don't know how that will project perfect. So nice to be here. Thanks for this opportunity to present the work which is ongoing. So the title of our presentation is How Do We Use Decarbonization Scenarios to Assess Development Projects' Consistency with Low Carbon Goals? And so I'm presenting this work with my collaborators and colleagues, David Groves, Camilla Kumpson, and Sam Farger. So the let's see. Here. Yeah, so the kind of the motivation for doing this work is, now we know many countries are committed to the net zero goals or low carbon development pathways, and many international development organizations like the World Bank is also committed to be aligned with the Paris Agreement. So how do we think about, all these aggregate targets relative to individual investment projects, both in the public sector and also private sectors, to really evaluate their consistency with the long-term goals. Currently, different frameworks have been used. Some of those are qualitative, like a checklist to see whether you are consistent with the Paris Agreement or not. And what we're exploring here is using scenarios and a quantitative approach to evaluate this set of questions. So including, can we look at activities, investment projects or development activities to assess whether they're consistent with the goal of the Paris Agreement or the low carbon goals? And do we know how consistent and how well these activities are aligned between the aggregate goals and individual activities? And can we assess the potential risks of locking in carbon? And and understanding the transition timeframe for low carbon technology adoption. So the work is probably a little bit different compared to some of the work presented here. Yeah, actually, this is probably also not the IAM, so we're actually not using IAM scenarios yet, but that will be in the future work. I'm not sure this is actually the full screen view. Maybe we can use this. Is it better? Okay, all right. So there are a number of analytical considerations when we think about doing this evaluation. So many questions that need to be explored and maybe answered as well. First of all, what would be the metrics to use? Do we look at the emissions, or do we think about the output, which also take into consideration a country's development objectives and being tied to well-being components? And what about the scale for the assessment? It could be ranging from an investment project level, which is very granular, to sectoral policy or maybe even economy-wide policy of a country. What about the boundary of analysis? Do we only look at the direct emissions? And what about all these like system and value chain implications? And also, how about the country context? How do we consider a country's development objectives and the social, economic, and institutional conditions? And also the range of uncertainties also come with all the different alternative pathways being evaluated, and all the other components may be driving that uncertainty, including technology trajectory, political feasibility, and behavioral and preferences. So this is a graph I think everyone is familiar with is from the 1.5 degree report. And so there are different scenarios or pathways we could be exploring by looking at, emissions from individual sectors or activities, all the way from ranging from the IEMs and that being discussed very extensively at this meeting. And there's also possibility of using country-led long-term strategies. Those are usually developed with input from the stakeholders and with consideration of the country's preferences and conditions and context, and also other potential country assessment. They usually come in different level of granularity and details, but also introducing, uncertainties as well. So this framework we're proposing that we're also exploring is a quantitative method for evaluating, a consistency with the long-term decarbonization goals. And there are a few considerations for this that we are exploring. One is we propose that we should be looking at emissions intensity rather than emissions, which is a better way to incorporate and reflect the country's development objectives and other potential well-being objectives or metrics. And some of these are technical details, so we probably with the examples that we'll be showing, it will become to be more apparent. The other one is, we don't want to look at just one point in time, but it's really looking at, over time, the average emission intensities to be compared against the scenarios. And also, to address the uncertainty, it's also important to explore multiple scenarios to look at, the potentially different pathways, and also, there's model uncertainty as well. So here's a case study that I'll be presenting, which is an example, which is a real World Bank investment project in Western Asia in a country, which is a transportation project, which is looking at the freight sector, making investment in the country's rail logistics, that you're basically increasing the rail network in the country with critical nodes. And this is alternative to the current investment, which is based on road networks and a lot of trucks being used for the freight transport and the logistics support. So the benefit of the project is, it's lower emissions from the rail compared to trucks, and also it's lower cost for freight transportation through the rail system. And the potential greenhouse gas emissions drivers from the project would also be, including emissions from the rail transport. It depends on the energy being used, but also there's benefit of reduced emissions from the trucks through the model shift. So how do we evaluate GHG emissions in this context? So at the bank, usually the way it's a project's greenhouse gas emissions being calculated is comparing, the project investment and relative to baseline of without the project. So in this case, on the left-hand side, you will see, so without the project, we will see the increase in freight transport demand over time, and there's also associated emissions from the trucks. But when we have the project, which is on the right-hand side, we see the rail, really started to contribute to a bigger shift in the total freight transport service demand. And at the same time, the emissions go down because of the emission intensity of rail transport is much lower. So even when we see a much higher demand for the demand and service provision from, for freight with the project, but we're also seeing this decrease in emissions. And to do the evaluation, we don't really compare that with the baseline of without project, but we're looking at, emissions for this component of the rail, the rail investment. So this is probably a distinction. Yeah, so We also happen to have done a country-level analysis for this whole country. It was recently published report to look at the emission, low-carbon development trajectories for different sectors. So this is the modeling done for the transport freight sector, that you see this increased demand over time for the whole sector, but in order to meet the net zero goal by 2060, which is the country's goal, the emissions will go down over time in the sector. So this results in the emission intensity for the sector based on the net zero, the net zero pathway, which goes down over time. So the way we do the analysis is comparing, thank you, comparing this benchmark to evaluate the project. So these two lines are showing the two different investments. The top one is without the project, so the freight emission intensity from the truck is pretty high. And when we have the rail investment, the carbon intensity is much lower. So it's only about 22% of the current intensity. And if we overlay the country's low carbon or net zero pathway for the sector, you see the freight low carbon trajectory needs to go down. And the two lines for the rail would intersect in about 2053. So before then, the whole rail project will be consistent with the goal of the Paris Agreement. But if without this project, the current trajectory is not. So we can also evaluate, based on the composition of the different investment for the sector, we can see the sector actually can be consistent with the net zero goal by 2046, about that. And then after that, the alignment will become to be an issue. So there needs to be consideration for additional policy changes or investment. Yeah, so we can also look at the potential risk of carbon lock-in using this approach. So by about 2053, the rail project will also not be aligned with the net zero goal. Yeah, so we also can use this kind of quantitative approach to look at how well the project is doing compared to the goal. So this is a benchmark of the cumulative emission throughout the lifetime for the project. So the current investment, you can tell, like the truck is not consistent. It's quite much above the needed emission reductions, but the rail project is highly consistent over time. And so it's also good for informing decisions about what additional investment is needed. So for the truck sector, there has to be additional either some shift in the transportation mode, or you can think about electrification for the truck fleet as well, or using other low carbon technology. Oh, so maybe I should say a little bit. So this is where the uncertainty actually will come in. So currently we are only exploring one scenario based on the work, but really the benchmark itself is uncertain. So the next step, we're going to be looking at different scenarios, including from the IAMs, maybe downscale to the country level and see what we can find. And ideally, we should be looking at additional scenarios to really explore this uncertainty space for the evaluation. So preliminary insights and some of our observation is, the low carbon emission scenarios really can be used to quantitatively assess the consistency of individual investment projects or development activities with decarbonization goals. And, instead of using emissions or energy input, we really think the carbon intensity is a better metric for benchmarking because it would better capture the other social economic goals or development objectives of the country while evaluating the consistency with low carbon pathways. So the scenarios point about using different alternative pathways, I think is another one that we I just discussed already, in order to explore the uncertainty. And this is more specific point about the carbon locking assessment, because it's another big question that we're also trying to answer as well. So I will leave there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Are there any questions?
Thank you for your presentation. Can you show a bit quickly how you calculate the carbon intensity for the project itself? Like for
yeah. Let's see if I can go back. So this is, this is how we did it. This is basically, we have methodology to evaluate the greenhouse gas emissions of the projects. And then the intensity was basically calculated based on the emissions versus the service. So it's really just the ratio between the two. And I think for the trucks, it's done the same way. And then we look at the rail, so we look at emissions over what is it? Yeah, so the freight service being provided.
Perfect, thank you. I have an extra question, but maybe later on as well.
Any other questions? I have one very quick one. So at the beginning, you told us you had the analysis framework and you discussed the metrics between emissions and carbon intensity. I'm wondering if vulnerability of these transport modes to extreme climate events is also a metric that affects your investment decisions at the bank.
Yeah, not in this particular case, but this is actually a really interesting point you are raising. A lot of the work actually I'm doing is more on the resilience side. So we're developing evaluation metrics to look at the resilience attributes. So there's a whole rating system to look at, is the project considering climate risks, and is it considering the, mitigation measures? Is it doing any quantitative stress testing? So ultimately, what we're hoping to do is for any one investment project, we're looking at both emissions implications and also resilience attributes. So bring that all in one framework, and thinking about the economic viability, which will also include, thinking about the shadow price of carbon on the emission side, but also the climate impacts. So making sure all these are, holistically considered. But we're not there yet, so this is all part of the process of doing that.
Yeah, thank you very much for presenting, and we are looking forward to hear more. The third presenter is George Xexakis from University of Geneva and Holistic. So George, please. Just a second.
Okay. I guess we can start. Perfect, okay. So as they say, now for something completely different. So we're now going to move a bit more from using simple tools to using interactive tools for two different aspects. So in this presentation, I'm going to show you two empirical studies about evaluating such tools for stakeholder engagement and scenario communication. Both of these studies have been done in the context of my PhD in the University of Geneva, and I'm also going to show you some applications in a future project in Paris Reinforce. So the context here, it's interactive scenario tools, and what I mean by them is tools that could be used for exploring scenario results, like the Scenario Explorer from IIASA or the Census Toolkit. But similar tools have been used also for stakeholder engagement, like for example in the UK and in Switzerland. And the problem here is that although there are many tools like this, empirical evaluations are not very common. So the problem here is that we use them a lot, but we don't know if they really work. So that's what my presentation is about. Specifically, it's about, again, 2 points. Like first, evaluating whether a tool like this can be used to enable stakeholder engagement for enriching large ensembles of model-based scenarios. And the point here is, the highlight here is the large, because I wanted to see patterns in scenario like development and how these tools can be used to enrich them. The second study is evaluating whether such a tool performs better than a static equivalent format for scenario communication. That was mostly to see its performance, but also in comparison with something that was used also in the past for scenario communication. So to see if it's really worth it to use such tools. In both studies, I used an interactive scenario tool that was developed in the context of my PhD called RiskMeter. The RiskMeter is a tool for exploring scenarios for electricity supply, so not an integrated assessment model, but it's a simple electricity supply model behind. And as an interface is also common to previous tools that can be used for energy and climate change. That was also intentional because we wanted to see whether we're evaluating this tool, if the results will be also relevant to the other tools. As from the point of usability, it's quite simple. The users can use, so they can change the sliders on the left to add the electricity supply from a technology of their choice. So for example, here, solar photovoltaics. That increases the supply in the country, here Switzerland, and they can also see negative impacts of the electricity supply in different factors like climate change, costs, accidental impacts, etc. The point of this exercise for when it was used for stakeholder engagement was to create a scenario that was fulfilling the demand of the country. Just the last point on this is that the tool itself has been also translated and used in and developed for also 3 other countries and the EU as a whole. For the first study, this is about stakeholder engagement. What we did was we wanted to first see what was there in scenario development in these countries already. So we focused on France, Germany, Poland, because there are quite big member states of the EU, and we wanted to see if scenario development that has happened there corresponds to what stakeholders would choose here. And what we did in this, we did a scenario review, and we extracted scenarios on electricity supply for 2035. Why 2035? We wanted to see, because we're working on electricity supply, so 2040 was a major date for the EU plans for decarbonizing its power sector. So we thought that 2035 is going to be a good point to evaluate whether scenarios correspond with stakeholder views. And then we elicited these stakeholder views, these preferred scenarios. So bear in mind that through this risk meter is not just simple stakeholder views that you could get from a survey. It's a bit more than that, because users have to, they should have a trade-off, and create a technical feasible scenario through the risk meter. So there was also the point of the exercise also to make something that is comparable more or less to the model-based scenarios. And from its citizens, we collected scenarios both for their own countries and for the EU to see if their views changed in this different spatial level. And finally, we compared the model-based scenarios with the preferred scenarios for each country and for the EU. Moving on to the results. So, yeah, I cannot go back, unfortunately. So I'm going to show you the main results that we find. With blue, you can see the model-based results, and with green is the preferred scenarios. I don't know if it's fully visible in the screen, but it's like For solar photovoltaics and fossil fuels with CCS, what we find is that model-based scenarios have much less supply than the ones preferred by the citizens. And for solar photovoltaics, it was a bit more expected, more or less, because it is a technology that we see consistently in surveys that is popular. Fossil fuels with CCS is less common. This could be because of a trade-off between people want to keep maybe some of their fossil fuel infrastructure of the countries, especially in Poland. Maybe France is not very relevant here, but still they didn't want the climate impacts. They could see the climate impacts, so they chose CCS maybe because of this. We see similar patterns for Germany and Poland. Again, citizens preferring more solar photovoltaics and fossil fuels with CCS than models. And in contrast, models stick a bit more to the, let's say, business as usual, although not all these model-based scenarios that we collected, some of them were business as usual, but some of them, there were also ambitious scenarios for these countries with large changes. And we see, for example, for France that model-based scenarios choose to use more nuclear than citizens. Germany, it was more coal and natural gas. And Poland, it was citizens preferred much less coal. I mean, it was like 10% less, 10 times less coal than what the average models would choose. The same pattern was shown for the EU. So again, with blue, you can see the model-based scenarios. So we saw that we saw less solar photovoltaics and less fossil fuels with CCS than what was preferred by the citizens, and more nuclear power, natural gas, and coal. So now I'm going to make a switch to the second study. So this was stakeholder engagement. Now we're going to go to communication. And then in the end of the presentation, I'm going to show you overall results. For this study, we used again the risk meter, but we did a between groups experiment where one group used the risk meter as a tool for exploring different scenarios, and another group used a static equivalent format that I'm going to show you in the next slide. Before we go there, we evaluated performance in terms of communication based on understanding, trust, and engagement. We measured it in two ways: in a self-reported way, where we asked our participants, did you find it understandable? Did you find trustworthy? And tested, for example, for understanding was a true or false quiz. So we asked questions like, do solar photovoltaics increase impacts, massive impacts on climate change? And they had to answer true or false in this kind of questions. Just a word about the static format. This was just a web page with 4 scenarios and storylines. This, of course, the 4 scenarios, the limited amount of scenarios, a typical way to communicate scenarios in a story and simulation approach. And we wanted to see if this approach would work better, this kind of more traditional approach would work better with our sample. To go to the results, with blue you can see the correct answers for the people having the static format, with red the ones having the interactive format. And contrary to our hypothesis, users of the interactive tools had less correct answers than the ones of the static tools, so they performed worse. Looking a bit why this has happened, it was from the don't know answers, we see that it was maybe not because they couldn't find the information, because the don't know answers are in the similar level, but because maybe users in the interactive tools were more confused. And our hypothesis of why this happened is that because these interactive tools, also ours, also others that are used, they have a lot of synchronicity in their outputs. So when you change one slider, you see outputs changing in different figures, and that might have confused our participants. Also, in the self-reported understanding, trust and engagement, we didn't find any statistical significant difference between the two. Again, we thought that the tool would be much more engaging because it also looks a bit more like a game, etc. But this, we didn't find any result to support this hypothesis. To conclude, I'm going to start with the last study for scenario communication. We found no measurable advantage of the interactive scenario tool over the static format potentially because of this synchronicity issue. That's not to say that interactive scenario tools should not be used for scenario studies. I mean, they should be used, but we have to be careful how we design them, and definitely we need to test them before deployment, or even better, while we develop them. And for the first study, for stakeholder engagement, we see that these kind of tools that were quite useful in collecting large amounts of scenarios. So what would be typically done in a workshop, that you collect some tens of preferences, here was done with hundreds, and we believe that this is a very important advantage of using such tools. Of course, there is a problem, of course, that especially with non-expert users like citizens, you have to ensure that the people, they know enough. They will not have any major misconception that would affect results. Just a final note on applying these insights to new development. So, through my new affiliation, I'm involved in the development of the IM Paris platform. This platform is developed in the context of the Paris Reinforce Horizon project, and it's going to be extended by 2 new Horizon projects. It's a portal of documentation and scenario results from integrated assessment models, but the point is that we want to make it as a portal for the whole community. And applying a bit of the insights here, we developed an interface for policymakers using policy questions to guide the users. So that's a principle when you design interactive interface, that it says that you should first show overview and then details. So we try to do that in how we develop this interface by first showing the overview of the answer for a specific question, for specific policy questions, and then a number of interactive interfaces that users can explore in an ad hoc way, so not overwhelm them directly with a huge interface. And for stakeholder engagement, we are planning to integrate an interactive tool for co-developing fuzzy cognitive maps with stakeholders, also as a way of conceptual, of doing conceptual mapping, conceptual modeling, and informing scenario development and modeling. Yeah, that's it from my side. Thank you for your attention. And, yeah.
Thank you very much, George. I especially like your finding and warning about the use of interactive scenario environments. They are not necessarily useful in understanding. So for questions, I see one hand here, one hand there. We start.
Hi. I'm not sure it's a question or a short comment. You showed that interactive tools are complex and the static ones works better than the interactive ones. And I believe you did a survey, and maybe there should be a learning curve on these kind of platforms, and maybe you can include your survey that which one you prefer in the future, or in a long term, in a short term, or maybe I cannot come up with questions, of course, I'm not expert on it, but for maybe a couple of questions that includes the learning curve of these kind of tools could be profitable in a long term. But I really like the policymaker explainability stuff, and because also a couple of approaches that I'm using, it's hard to explain the results to the policymaker, and it's really important. So that's my comments. Thank you.
If I can answer quickly, I mean,
Please,
thank you for your comments. It's a very good point indeed. Like, I think there is indeed a learning effect. I mean, at least for example, from my experience with, for example, the IIASA Scenario Explorer, which is extremely useful, like in this aspect. But I see myself when I first used it, like it was not, let's say, at the beginning extremely easy, but then it became, and now I now use it very, very easy. So also for similar tools, like also, for example, the Climate Action Tracker, these are tools that we are consistently using all the time, and there's definitely a learning curve there. But I think the point of this study was mostly that we need testing. We shouldn't assume that if something looks good to us and our colleagues in our scientific environment will work for all the other stakeholders that we want to engage. Thank you.
There was one more question here.
Pretty similar as well. But I wonder if if you do the survey in several rounds across time, if you will be able to pick a more significant impact of the features of the tool on learning. So I think that would be definitely interesting. And the other dimension that I think it might be interesting exploring is the different configurations of the tool. I mean, now it's static and dynamic, but you could have like more buttons, less buttons, more graphics, less graphics. Could be, could eventually become a very interesting experimental setup on a, longitudinal analysis, and potentially very useful because that's what everyone kind of is working on. And we don't really have a guideline to develop this, and that this agenda could eventually provide empirical evidence for that.
That's also a very good point. I think, and also this idea of creating a framework of how to do this usability testing, I mean, it's going to be extremely valuable. I mean, we are also trying to work on this direction, also maybe with this new platform. But especially this kind of like longitudinal studies, it's exactly what we would need for when we develop such a tool. Like, it doesn't have to be extremely official all the time, a huge, like release with new things, etc. But even changing a bit and seeing the results, like what other communities are doing in software development with this A/B testing, etc. That would be, already helpful. Let's say.
Thank you very much. So I think we will continue the discussion after the last presentation by Merle. And Merle is going to talk about co-creating sustainability pathways.
Thank you, Sybil. Yes, hello from my side. I'm Merle Remy. I work at the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies. And I need to change this into presentation mode. Yes, and I'm going to give this presentation really on behalf of the whole SSP consortium, and the presentation was also prepared together with Sarah Cornell from the Stockholm Resilience Center. And yes, we're going to talk about why create scenarios with stakeholders and why create target-seeking scenarios. So SSP is really set in the current policy context of the Agenda 2030 and the Paris Accord, and how can we create scenarios that capture those targets, and how can we do this in connection with integrated assessment modeling, which, well, as we have heard over the last days, are very important in this science policy context. And of course, there are very many different perspectives and tensions out there on how we can go about sustainable development. And it's also that solutions in one place might create problems in other places, and how can we actually capture this diversity in perspectives, and also the tensions in societal and scientific debate. We are focusing on target-seeking scenarios that may have like a special place in the policy cycle. So IPBES has a really nice graphic on that, and so target-seeking scenarios are a form of intervention scenarios, so exploring strategies, and so there's a need to really capture today's diversity. And so the question SHAPE, or for us as the Stakeholder Engagement Working Group, was also how can we actually create mutual learning about these things. So we are going to present a tool for, co-creating target-seeking scenarios. It's called the branching point approach that we used in SHAPE. And we want to highlight two aspects of this approach here in this talk. And one is how can we actually capture this plurality of perspectives, and then also how, since we are also working with integrated assessment models, how can we make the translation between those qualitative narratives maybe a bit more transparent. How do we translate this into quantitative modeling assumptions? And how can we actually better communicate about those things? And this relates to uncertainty in three ways. Well, one is quite clear. If we engage stakeholders, then we can broaden our knowledge base. Then, of course, models, integrated assessment models, analyze how complex systems behave. I think we have heard a lot about this in the last days. And then we also put here a bullet point on, IAMs and models are often very, black boxes to scenario users, and how can we actually maybe, shade a bit more light on those black boxes. So the SHAPE approach is based on approach by Aguiar, Ana Paula Aguiar, who's also a colleague of us in the consortium. And so the basic idea is to structure the construction of those scenarios into different branching points, or first define branching points in topics that, we consider very relevant for sustainable development. So very broadly, like what does that mean for like societal development? What does it mean for sustainable production and consumption? Or as Ana Paula used this in her first project, what does it imply for actors in agriculture? How can urban and rural relationships actually develop? And then we define branching options, so different ways how these things can actually develop in different contexts. And yes, I'm going to talk now about how we did this in SHAPE. So as the consortium, we drafted the first set of those branching points and branching options so that our stakeholders actually have something that they can refer to and get to know or familiarize themselves with. And so we came up with 12 dimensions, meaning like topic areas relevant for sustainable development, and 3 branching options for each dimension. So for each dimension. And then in the next step, those branching options are then combined into comprehensive narratives. And so the outcome were, at the moment, 5 sustainable development pathway narratives, of which we labeled 3 main and 2 alternative. I'll come to that. And so how did we do this with the stakeholders? So as I mentioned, we drafted this, and then we had an in-depth workshop for 3 afternoons, and really went from one topic to the other, discussed with stakeholders where do they agree that this is actually a branching option, where should we maybe split up dimensions. For example, we had first combined future of work and overall economic development. So one result out of this dialogue was actually to split this up and then have different branching options for future of work, and then also for the overall economic development. And maybe also to mention the dialogue is ongoing, and so the SHAPE project is not yet completely done, but we had our 2 big workshops, and the first one was really on creating those narrative combinations, and the second one was more focusing on modeling assumptions. How do we actually translate those narratives into the model parameters? So we have few visualizations of how we did combine those branching options into our narratives. So the first narrative is called economy-driven innovation, and you can see like the branching options highlighted in yellow. I hope so, at least. It's yellow here. So they are one coherent or plausible narrative. Then we can move to our green combination. Well, not green in the sense of sustainable development, because all of those branching options are supposed to, well, show sustainable solutions. This would be, or this scenario focuses more on how communities can actually drive sustainable development. And then we have also a narrative how governments can drive sustainable development. So yeah, those are the three main combinations. And then we have, just to illustrate how we can recombine those branches, another pathway would be local solutions that we developed in SHAPE, and also green and social market economy. So you can actually, I hope you can nicely see that those different colors highlighted show different combinations, and there are of course more possible. On the other hand, it's also clear that not all combinations make sense as a narrative. Then again, hearing Kaspar Cook last night in the plenary, he says, well, we should maybe encourage more, well, scenarios that are not necessarily plausible but make sense in the sense that they are relevant or, well, at different scales. So maybe this branching point approach can be of help there. So that was the first part of our, maybe tool, how to actually create those narratives. And now I'm coming to the second part, why we found this tool useful, and this is translating the SDP narratives into model parameters. And what you can see is that, well, similar to the color coding on the previous slide, so we have like a yellow column, a green column, and a red one. So those are the different branching options. And then you can see on the left-hand column the SDP characteristics and also the dimensions that are associated with those different SDP characteristics. So for instance, when we talk about different options for land and food, which would be like the fourth row, then we have, well, different dietary patterns. So for economy-driven innovation in those sustainable development pathway, we would rather have a high-tech green, like animal-free foods, but also like artificial food production focus. Then the community-driven pathway would focus more on eat Lancet diet and so on. So I think another example would be how do we look at economic development. So the resilient community scenario, for example, has a post-growth approach integrated, and that's very different to the other two pathways. So, and what we found is that this actually makes it more transparent to communicate also in our workshop with the stakeholders and the webinars, how we translate those different narratives from the qualitative to the quantitative model parameters, and how we can actually trace back certain aspects that they had also mentioned or, well, put forward in the first workshop. One drawback is, of course, that we can't, or that some of the breadth of the perspectives in those qualitative narratives gets lost in the translation to quantitative parameters because of the way the models are constructed. And I can say that the SHAPE consortium, our modelers, they are actually advancing certain modeling aspects. So I think there has been work going on inequality issues, how to integrate this into the IMs. But other aspects might not be directly integrated yet. But we can use this approach to be transparent about this. And yeah, this brings me to our last slide. So basically summing up, and yeah, an asset is to, well, facilitate structured dialogues so we can zoom into certain dimensions of this scenario, zoom into certain different approaches for those dimensions, kind of, yeah, distill like diverging views and also capture them in this certain, yeah, in this dimension. We have spelled out those branching options and also, yeah, to some extent the quantified elements, and this can hopefully or maybe be used by other modeling groups as well, but also like to, yeah, deepen the conversation about strategies of the transformations with stakeholders by zooming in into different topics. And yes, I think, yeah, it makes it possible to better communicate on modeling strengths, and then maybe also make, or hopefully make, those modeling results a bit more useful to scenario users who are really not in this modeling community. And yes, as mentioned before, challenge is certainly that, yeah, how can we actually even increase like the breadth of perspectives in the quantitative parameters in the end. And with that, thank you, and open for questions.
And I want to take over. Can I take my face mask off for a moment? Okay, so Merlin, you don't run away that fast. There might be a couple of quick questions for you before we... Wait, there are 2 quick questions for you. So, Susanna first, and if you can pass the microphone along when you're done.
Okay, thank you. This is Susanna Machkwa from Equitable and from Stockholm Resilience Center, and thanks, Marla, for a really nice presentation. And you know, like I really like the approach that you presented, and I was just wondering if you could quickly reflect on, you know, like to what extent it's possible to maintain some kind of like account of, you know, like transparent account of like what was the input of the participants into these branching points, and what was the input of the experts who were processing that information. For instance, like when you were making a connection between those different branches and the actors that these branches are related to, you know. So I was wondering, like, yeah, if it's possible to keep some kind of track of what of these connections are brought by the participants and what of them, you know, are brought by the experts. Thank you.
Yes, yeah. So by experts, you mean especially like the translation process into
the researchers who
yeah. So I think like the first phase of the narrative development was, yeah, it was quite. It is a challenge to, yeah, sort of see where what gets where in from the input. But I think one example that is very clear is that, yeah, to split up like some of the dimensions, that was a result from the workshop that came from our stakeholders. Also integrating like the post-growth aspect more. And then I think the whole quantification phase, that was really more of a modeler's work. But then we organized like different webinars and yeah, sort of open up this part of the process for questions and challenging assumptions. But I think, yeah, that's there really you see the challenge of you need to know more about those models to, yeah, really work with the models. I don't know, Sarah, do you want to add any thoughts on that?
It's a learning process for everybody involved.
Okay, yes, thank you very much for the presentation. So yeah, I'm Paula Harrison, UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. So I was really interested in the part of the process where you've defined your branching points and you've got your 3 dimensions, and then how you actually combine them together. Mm-hmm. And in terms of that process of combining them together, how you take account of the interrelationships between the different dimensions, and then if there's a temporal dimension to the narratives that would then help with those interrelationships to ensure that there is consistency, or that you're if you find inconsistency, you can deal with it in part of the stakeholder process.
Yes, so maybe an example. So we originally had 6 narrative combinations, and one was actually very much criticized by our stakeholders for not being realistic at all, because it was based on like high level of shared values across like the global governance systems. And so in the end, we took that combination out, and maybe that's, yeah, part of the answer. And then on the temporal scale, maybe, I mean, since we're looking at 2030 targets and 2050 targets, this kind of narrows down the, I think, like the way things can develop, because we have those targets set at the certain years. Yeah. Not sure if that was a good answer.
I think it was as good as that answer can get, actually, because I'm still thinking about the question as well. Marla, I'm going to get rid of this and see if we can get back to our... Do you know where our big chairperson's slide is? All right, before I move on at all, I want to just check, do we have anyone participating online? And is there any interest from them in any questions or comments? That sounds like a no. Okay, so I'm really pleased that we've got some time for more ongoing discussion to everybody who's presented. Does anybody have a starter comment that's more general for everybody? And now I've lost the microphone. Okay. Ben first.
Hi, I'm Ben Matthews. I have, I could expand in many directions on this, but I have a long experience, among other things, of climate negotiations in the COP process, and including on the topic of equity and justice, going back to about 1995, actually. But what my experience is you know, when I'm in a place like IIASA and people have really complex models, and then they're a little bit afraid of interactive tools because, you know, that might be wrong, it might be a mistake, etc. My experience, you have to ask the question, what are we really competing with in the real negotiation process? I mean, when those equity questions are discussed, what actually happens is that huddles gather in corridors and do back-of-the-envelope calculations, and sometimes they are badly wrong. And this is really piece of paper calculations based on people's high school mathematics, and that's what was influencing the evolution of the conference. You know, so if we have interactive tools that can react fast in response to a new problem, of course, if it's a completely old problem, you have pre-prepared results. But at the same time, the stakeholders in this case are not completely new citizens. They have a long history of working in the topic. They're experts, but what they need is a quick re-evaluation in response to a new problem. And so, sorry, I'm just checking what I was going to say. I mean, so there's, you know, there are many kinds of stakeholders, and there are experts who are not actually modelers but know the topic but need fast tools, and I think there is use for that. But we have attention. I mean, as Georges was talking about the discussion about learning curves, and you know, do the people using the tools have enough time to get used to them? And maybe it would be more effective if they had several, you know, iterative sessions on that. And we have a tension between, therefore, complexity and simplicity. And I think this applies to everybody. And you had a wonderful phrase there, avoid premature aggregation. I try to do that myself in my model. I mean, I have, you know, lots of detail. I have interactive model myself. In my experience of that 20-year history of that model, the earlier versions, when it was simpler, were much more popular for a stakeholder educational point of view. And then we had research projects, and they added far too much complexity. And actually, what I tried to do in the last year is revive the spirit of the earlier model with a completely new interface and approach, and you can find the link to that on the effect from this session. There's a link to my poster, which some of you have seen, and then the website. But the tension is always there between simplicity and complexity, and I suppose that's what it's just a sort of summary question to think about. Do we make these things more accurate and more complex, or do we make them simpler and probably wrong? And you know, both are useful, I think. We have to do both.
All right, we have a response. we have a response. And I remind you that it's kind of 5 minutes till coffee. So.
Okay, I'll try to be quick. Yeah, I think you made two different points, and the first one is the negotiations part, and the other part, the models are simpler or the complex ones. So I will comment on the policy negotiation part. One of my colleagues actually working with the computer science department, and we try to simulate policy debates, these kind of negotiations, and like try to come up with the clusters, which kind of words ended up in terms of different justice principles because of my topic, justice. So how can we explain these justice principles in terms of policy makers' wording or sentences? So we are actually trying on this, and I think it's a really important point. Also, yeah, I totally forget your name. Wait, George. Yeah, I think your point is also makes sense, the interaction and learning things and stuff. But for the second point, okay, yeah, for the second point, the simpler model or complex model, I think we researchers, we just try to make it complex and simpler, and again complex in time differently. But at the end of the day, I think we need to make it complex as possible. Then we need to try to conclude in a simple version of it. And the simple explanations, we need to tell them useful version. I don't know, turning them into useful versions. But I think the 2 points are really great, and yeah, I'm currently also working on with my colleagues at them. So thanks.
I like that, useful and usable. Sibel, you're next.
I think, yeah, many thoughts. First of all, I think to follow up on this discussion, it's harder to build simple models and tools than complex ones, because we really need to be smart, and often it takes longer time at first to build a large tool and then simplify it to a more useful one. I had actually question maybe on your presentation, Merle. The branching approach reminded me dynamic adaptive policy pathways method developed by Marjolein Hasnoot at Deltares, but they do it more modeling wise. Yours is more participatory. So I was wondering if there could be synergies between the two methods. And also, when you show this branching, of course, the first thing that comes into mind, was there any input from the stakeholders about doomsday scenarios where we branch into unsustainable pathways?
Thanks, Sybil. I think I will start with the second question, because I might have a better answer there. Yes, they always ask about doomsday scenarios, why we are not doing that. And maybe I didn't really highlight this enough, because the aim of the Sustainable Development Pathways is really to have different pathways achieving sustainable development and the Paris Agreement, and that's why we didn't go down the road of doom. Yeah. But yeah, the question came up a lot. On your other question, I have to admit I'm not too familiar with.
Was more like a response to another question.
Okay, I might just take it up as a comment.
I hate to say, okay, we have plenty to discuss, but I'm going to take a little intervention, and then we can carry on the discussion in our coffee break. I want to highlight, actually I can't, how can I make, all right, it's going to happen as if by magic. I want to highlight the fact that the discussion also contains inputs in posters. So if they're still up and if people haven't seen them, I'd really encourage people to look at Ben's and also Claudia Vinos and Angelo Carlino's posters. And of course, look online. I also want to name check some really nice discussions that happened in session 29 and session 12. So if you have a chance to go back over the machinery of the forum, go and do that. And one final most exciting thing is that, again, in close alliance with session 29, one really focused on stakeholder engagement, we're going to be leading a special issue, editing a special issue for Frontiers in Environmental Sciences that really tries to look at the ways in which we learn from much more engaged and participatory processes in the development of scenarios, quantitative, qualitative, narrative, useful, and sustainability oriented. So that's a plug, and I've taken notes from everybody for our editorial of that special issue. And there were a couple of final questions, but I really want to just make sure that we do the applause first, and then we can have the sort of more informal conversation. So. Okay, now you're free to stay, walk, and interrogate. And feel free to, I'm going to stand next to Merle and be as part of the same project as well. But thank you everyone for really engaged discussions. We appreciate it. And for really cool insights in use and usability.